What do you do when a perfectly normal school run turns into the end of the world? That's the question Mariah Santos faced on a Tuesday morning. One moment she was holding her little girl's hand, talking about show and tell. The next, the sky ripped open, raining down streaks of liquid fire. She didn't have time to process. Instinct took over. She grabbed her daughter and ran. But where can you possibly go when the world itself is coming apart at the seams? Screams were everywhere as buildings folded like paper. The air grew scorching hot, like trying to breathe inside an oven, thick with the taste of smoke and dust. Maria found a cellar already crammed with 30 other terrified souls. Huddled in the suffocating dark, all they could do was listen to the symphony of their city being destroyed. Her 7-year-old Sophia just kept pulling on her sleeve, whispering, "Mommy, what's that noise?" Maria had no answer. For 6 solid hours, their world was chaos. And when the shaking finally stopped, the alien ships came down. Thousands of Vith Kai soldiers marched through the wreckage, but they weren't there to conquer anyone. They were there to collect. The Vith Kai moved with a chilling purpose, sorting the survivors. If you were old or sick, you were shot on the spot. No questions asked. You were useless. But if you were young and strong, they slapped glowing shackles on you and herded you onto colossal transport ships, bound for a short, miserable life of hard labor. In that horrifying mess, they tore Sophia straight from Maria's arms. Maria fought like a wild animal, scratching and screaming, but the butt of a rifle slammed into her temple, and everything went black. She woke up in the bone-chilling hold of a ship, pressed so tightly against strangers she could barely breathe. Her daughter was gone, and a cold, dark certainty settled in her heart. She was never going to see Sophia again. The Vith Kai raid on the new Cascadia colony was over in just 3 days. When they left, they took 4 million human beings with them. And they left 14 million dead. Haven City was now a skeleton of ash and twisted metal. Lush green forests were now just acres of black, bony trees. The rivers ran thick with a toxic green slime. A world full of life had been turned into a planet-sized tombstone. The first rescue ships from Earth didn't arrive for 2 weeks. When they did, they found survivors hiding in subway tunnels and deep caves. They found mass graves that went on for miles, and they found data logs that had recorded everything. The sounds of pure panic, the roar of the inferno, and the final chilling moments of families being ripped apart by the Vith Kai's casual brutality. Captain James Chen was on one of those first ships. As he walked through the ruins of the city, his tears cut clean tracks through the grime on his face. His brother, his wife, and their 3 children had lived here. He spent days digging through the rubble, clinging to a sliver of hope so small it was almost insane. But the only place he found his family's names was on the monument to the dead. Standing in the ashes of what used to be his brother's home, he made a promise. He didn't say a word, but the rage and grief branded it onto his soul. Somebody was going to pay for this. Somebody was going to answer for 18 million lives. The news from New Cascadia hit the rest of humanity like a punch to the gut. On Earth, people cried in the streets. Across the other colony worlds, families were glued to their screens, desperate for news of anyone they knew. This wasn't like the old wars, human against human. This was something else entirely. This was an attack by a species that had no mercy, something that looked at humanity and saw nothing but livestock. to be either put to work or put down. The United Earth Federation government sent a desperate message to the Galactic Concord. The Concord was the big show, the council of 12 ancient powerful races who made the rules for the rest of the galaxy. They were supposed to be the peacekeepers, the ones who protected the little guys. Surely they'd do something. Ambassador Elena Vasquez was chosen to speak for humanity. At 52, she was a veteran diplomat who had spent her entire life trying to build bridges. She was a woman who genuinely believed that peace and understanding were always possible. She truly thought that no matter how messy it got, there was still a place for justice in the galaxy. She flew to the Concord's great station, a massive structure floating in neutral territory that was older than human civilization itself. It was built by races who were ancient when humans were still discovering the wheel. This was the place where the fates of entire species were decided. Elena entered the grand chamber, her shoulders back and her head high. The room was breathtakingly huge, with rows of seats rising up around a central stage. The delegates from the 12 races stared down at her. Some had shimmering scales, others thick fur. Some looked like they were carved from living crystal, while others were things her mind couldn't even label. But they all shared one thing. They were ancient, they were powerful, and they all looked down at her like she was a child who had just interrupted a very important meeting. "The human representative may approach," the Concord's chairman announced. He was a creature of living stone called the Primarch, and he'd been running this council for 3,000 years. Elena walked to the center of the floor. Her voice was steady when she spoke, but inside, her heart was hammering with grief and fury. 18 million of my people are dead," she said. "Another 4 million have been taken into slavery. Our colony on New Cascadia has been wiped off the map. This was a completely unprovoked attack. We had no argument with the HFY Dominion. We had no beef with them whatsoever. They came to our home and slaughtered our children for a single simple reason. Because they could. Because they wanted free labor, and they were arrogant enough to believe no one would have the guts to stop them." She paused, looking around at the alien faces, but they were unreadable. "We come to this council today to ask for justice," she went on. "We demand the return of our people. We demand that the ones responsible for this atrocity be held accountable. And we demand that you guarantee this will never, ever happen again. We are asking for the same thing any of you would ask for if your people were murdered and enslaved." When she was done, a deep silence settled over the chamber. Then the HFY representative stood up. His name was Kethfer, and he was the cousin of the commander who had led the assault. He looked at Elena with emotionless black eyes, his voice practically dripping with scorn. "The human speaks of murder and slavery as if these are terrible crimes," he sneered. "They are not. They are simply facts of life. The strong have always taken what they want from the weak. This is how the galaxy has always worked, and how it always will. Humanity is young. You're naive. You still haven't learned your place. Maybe this painful lesson will finally help you understand." Elena's hands clenched into tight fists. She fought to keep her voice from shaking. "You call butchering children a lesson?" she shot back. "I call it reality," Kethfor answered, his tone perfectly calm. "The HFY Dominion had a need for laborers. Your colony had laborers, so we acquired them. This is just business. If humanity doesn't like it, then I suggest humanity gets stronger." A quiet buzz of conversation immediately filled the room. Elena watched in disbelief as the ancient delegates talked amongst themselves. She could only catch a few words. Unfortunate, regrettable, and a complex situation. She heard them mention their trade deals with the Vthke. She heard them talk about anything and everything except doing what was right. After 3 hours, the Primarch raised his stony hand and the room fell silent. "The Concord has made its decision," he announced. "We recognize that the Vthkai Dominion's actions have caused humanity significant emotional distress. For this, the Vthkai will pay a fine to the United Earth Federation. The exact amount will be determined by a committee. In addition, the Vthkai representative will issue a formal apology. This issue is now closed." Elena just stared at him, unable to process his words. "A fine," she echoed, her voice breaking. 18 million people are gone, and you're offering us money? "The Concord's ruling is final," the Primarch said, his voice completely flat. "What about the slaves?" Elena pressed, her voice getting louder. "What about the 4 million men, women, and children being worked to death in Vthkai camps right now?" The Primarch was quiet for a long, awful second. Then he actually said, "The internal labor policies of a member state are not the Concord's business. The Vthkai are free to manage their workforce as they wish." "Workforce?" Elena's voice was sharp with disbelief. "You're calling people in chains a workforce. Your choice of words does not change the facts." Elena looked around the massive chamber at the beings of crystal, stone, and light, all of them ancient, all of them so accustomed to their power they had forgotten what it felt like to be weak and scared and broken. "So this is your justice," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper that was colder than ice. "You offer us blood money and an empty apology while our children are dead and our families are in chains. You call it an internal affair. Is this the grand protection you offer?" The Primarch's stone face showed nothing. "Humanity is not a member of this Concord," he stated, his voice as cold and empty as space itself. "You are here as observers only. In this chamber you have no rights beyond what we decide to grant you." "Then tell me what it takes to become a member," Elena shot back, playing her one and only desperate card. The Primarch's voice droned on, cold and dismissive. "Membership requires a unanimous vote from all 12 elder races. It also requires proof of a civilization that has traveled the stars for at least 10,000 years. Humanity has managed a mere 2 centuries. You are welcome to reapply in roughly 9,800 years." In that single, soul-crushing moment, something inside Elena didn't just crack. It atomized. It wasn't her heart that had already been ground to dust when she saw the first videos from New Cascadia. No, what died in that chamber was her faith, her belief that the galaxy held any goodness, that cooperation was possible, and that if you screamed for help, someone, somewhere might actually care enough to listen. And in that horrifying instant, she finally got it. They were completely, terrifyingly on their own. The great powers of the galaxy didn't give a damn about human homes being turned to ash or families being ripped apart by slavers. All they cared about were their trade routes, their political influence, and making sure their comfortable lives weren't disturbed. As she turned to leave, the crushing weight of total defeat settling on her shoulders, The Vithkai ambassador Kethvor spoke up one last time. "Ambassador Vasquez," he called out, his voice practically dripping with smug satisfaction. "You should really accept the offer. Be grateful we're giving you anything at all. Humanity is a fly buzzing in a galaxy of titans. You can't fight us. You can't stand against the Concord. You are helpless here. So take the money, mourn your dead, and move on. That is the best advice you will ever receive." Elena stopped dead in her tracks, slowly turning to lock her gaze onto his. She stared into those cold, arrogant black pits that served as his eyes, and said nothing at all. But her silence was a promise that echoed louder than any shout ever could. He actually believed it. The arrogant fool genuinely thought humanity would just whimper and accept this kind of humiliation. He had absolutely no idea what kind of hibernating beast he had just kicked awake. "You say we're helpless." Elena's voice sliced through the chamber's silence like a razor. "And maybe, for today, you're right. Today, we are weak. We are young. We are just a tiny spark in a galaxy that wouldn't even notice if we were snuffed out tomorrow. But I want every single one of you to burn this moment into your minds." She swept her gaze across the entire room, meeting the eyes of every delegate, one by one. "We are human," she said, her voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "We're the species that stared down ice ages and won. We survived plagues that tried to wipe our planet clean. We fought wars that set our own world on fire and clawed our way back from the embers. We are the ones who climbed out of caves and built ships that could reach for other suns. We are a species that literally does not know how to quit. Do you think we're going to forget what you let happen on New Cascadia? Not a chance. Do you think we will ever forgive this? We will not. Do you think this wound is just going to fade? It never will." She walked toward the massive exit doors, then paused for one final look back, her expression one they would never forget. "You will all remember this day," she promised them. "You'll remember that you had a choice. You could have stood for justice. You could have offered a hand when we were on our knees. You could have proven that morality means something in this galaxy, but you didn't. You chose to turn your backs. You chose profit over people. You chose the easy way out instead of the right one. That was your decision, and starting today, you get to live with what comes next." She walked out, and as the heavy doors sealed behind her, the sound of patronizing laughter echoed down the corridor. A few of the representatives thought her little performance was absolutely hilarious. A toddler of a species, puffing out its chest and making empty noises. It was pathetic. It was cute. But not all of them were laughing. Some of the older delegates, the ones who had witnessed empires rise and fall like waves on a shore, watched her leave in a profound and unsettling silence. They had been around for a very, very long time. They had seen it all before, and a few of them, though they would never admit it, felt a strange, cold shiver of dread. There was something in that human's eyes, a blaze in her voice that reminded them of ancient legends, stories of young, overlooked races that were pushed just a little too far. Species that became so consumed by their grief and rage that they were reforged into something else entirely, something to be feared. But that was ridiculous. Humans were too weak, too new, too unimportant to ever be a threat, weren't they? Of course, Elena went straight back to Earth and reported to the Federation Council. She told them everything. The Concorde's ice-cold rejection, the Vithkai's blatant mockery, and the disgusting offer of money in exchange for 18 million dead men, women, and children. When she finished, the silence in the room was so thick you could feel it. "So what is your official recommendation, Ambassador?" President Martinez finally asked, his voice heavy with grief. Elena paused for a long, painful moment, letting the gravity of her next words fill the air. When she finally spoke, her voice was the sound of ice cracking under pressure. "I recommend we accept nothing," she said. "I recommend we remember everything, and I recommend we start preparing for the day when we can finally talk to the galaxy in the only language it seems to understand." "And what language would that be?" the president asked. Elena looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze filled with a terrible new clarity, bought and paid for with an ocean of blood. "Power," she said. "We will speak to them with so much power they will have no choice but to listen." The council voted that very night. The decision was unanimous. Humanity would refuse the blood money. Humanity would not forgive the Vithkai, and humanity would never, ever forget. And so, the great silence began. The rest of the galaxy simply moved on. The loud, emotional, little human species, forgotten almost immediately. It was easy to do. Humans were a rounding error in the galactic census. They had 17 colonized worlds and a fleet of maybe a few hundred ships. The Vithkai Empire alone controlled 3,000 worlds and commanded a fleet of 50,000 warships. The ancient elder races of the conquered ruled over millions of star systems. In the grand scheme of things, humanity was less than a drop in a cosmic ocean. After Ambassador Vasquez's little outburst, there was some brief chatter about what the humans might try. Some of the more arrogant species expected a foolish, suicidal assault. Others predicted they would simply collapse into civil war, torn apart by their own sorrow. A few even thought humanity would just fade away, too shattered by the loss of New Cascadia to continue. None of that happened. Instead, humanity did something that not a single being in the entire galaxy could have foreseen. They simply went silent. Human diplomats still attended galactic functions, but they almost never spoke. Human cargo ships still plied the trade lanes, but their crews kept to themselves, avoiding eye contact in the cantinas of deep space ports. Human colonies kept running, but they stopped issuing visas to alien tourists. It was as if the entire human race had collectively pulled a giant curtain around their corner of space and just vanished from the galactic scene. At first, the elder races thought it was amusing. "It seems they're having a little temper tantrum," the Vithkai representative chuckled in the assembly hall. They scoffed, treating them like spoiled children who didn't get a new toy. "They'll come crawling back to us soon enough," they said, begging for scraps from our table. But the years began to drift by. A decade passed, then two, and humanity never came crawling back. They never asked for anything. They didn't even bother to complain. They just were. Quietly, without causing any trouble, doing nothing that looked even slightly significant or dangerous. So the galaxy moved on, wrapped up in its own endless games. There were trade disputes to be fought, new territories to be colonized, and old rivalries to be settled. Humanity became a forgotten footnote in the history books, and that was exactly what humanity had been counting on. Because behind that curtain of absolute silence, something utterly world-shattering was happening. Imagine being told your entire species doesn't matter, that your children can be stolen and murdered, and you just have to get over it. That was the galaxy's official message to humanity. 3 months after that insulting verdict, President Martinez addressed every human on every world, all 17 colonies at once. His face was grim, but his voice was a razor. "They've shown us our place," he said. "They told us we're young, weak, and that our lives are worthless. They ordered us to accept the slaughter of our children and move on." He paused, letting the anger build across the stars. "They told us there's nothing we can do." A cold fire lit in his eyes. "They are wrong." And then he announced the birth of Project Phoenix. It was the most monumental secret undertaking in the history of our species, a mission that would demand everything from everyone. The goal was simple to say, but almost impossible to achieve. In just 30 years, humanity would forge itself into a power so undeniable that the galaxy would never dare to ignore us again. "We will not forget our dead," Martinez vowed, his voice echoing in every home. "We will carry their memory as our shield and our sword. Their sacrifice will be the sacred fire that fuels us. And one day, we will demand the justice they were denied, not as beggars, but as equals." The response was like a tidal wave. Across every human planet, recruitment centers were mobbed. Scientists began working around the clock. Factory workers retooled their entire assembly lines overnight. Teachers threw out the old lesson plans and wrote new ones, making damn sure the story of New Cascadia and its righteous anger was a promise burned into the heart of every child. This mission reshaped every aspect of human life. The entire civilian economy pivoted to military production. Forget luxury goods. Every last resource was funneled into designing weapons and building warships. People accepted strict rationing without a word of complaint. If you asked them why they were giving up so much, the answer was always the same: for New Cascadia, for the 18 million. The education system was completely overhauled. Every school now taught the brutal, unfiltered truth of the attack. Children learned the names of the dead, not as a history lesson, but as a personal vow. Sofia Santos, age 7, Michael Chen, age 12, Emma Okafor, age 5. The names became a prayer, a promise connecting the generations. Military academies exploded, swelling to 10 times their previous size. An entire generation of young men and women, raised on the story of New Cascadia's fall, signed up in droves. This wasn't about personal revenge. It was about justice for their parents and grandparents, for the empty seats at their dinner tables, and the faded photos of relatives they'd never meet. One of those people was James Chen, the same captain who had walked through the smoking ruins of Haven City, who had lost his brother's entire family. He rose through the ranks with breathtaking speed, not because of his grief, but because of his genius. He saw space combat in a way the ancient, tradition-bound alien races couldn't even comprehend. He thought, planned, and fought on a whole different level. "The Vithkai expect us to line our ships up for a nice, honorable duel," he'd tell his cadets. "They expect 1,000-year-old strategies. We're not going to give them a battle. We're going to give them nightmares. He developed entirely new doctrines built on lightning speed, flawless network coordination, and constant adaptation. Every human ship would be a thinking node in a single interconnected mind. The enemy wouldn't be fighting a fleet. They'd be fighting one super-intelligent predator that could strike from everywhere at once. And while the military was rewriting the book on war, the scientists were trying to jump centuries ahead in technology. In charge of advanced weapons was Dr. Sarah Kim. She was a brilliant physicist whose own daughter was among the stolen. Every morning she'd look at a photo of her little girl, smiling with impossibly bright eyes. Then she'd go to her lab and design weapons that could crack a planet in half. "We won't start this war," she told her team, "but we will finish it so decisively that no one will ever dream of hurting us again." Her division produced one stunning breakthrough after another: engines that bent space, shields that were nearly unbreakable, and weapons that tore through defenses the elder races considered foolproof. And every new piece of tech was kept top secret. To the rest of the galaxy, human merchant ships still used clunky, outdated hardware, and our colonies looked laughably underdefended. All the new lethal technology was hidden away. The true heart of the revolution was in the shipyards, massive construction bays built in total secrecy, inside forgotten asteroid belts and the swirling storms of gas giants. The elder races had their spies, but humanity had perfected hiding in plain sight. New warships were assembled deep inside hollowed-out asteroids that registered as nothing but dead rock on galactic scanners. Admiral Chen, as James was now known, watched as the first of the new fleet slid from its secret dock. It was a beautiful and terrifying sight, a sleek black predator bristling with weapons powered by engines that could outrun a Vethkai nightmare. He named the class Vengeance. "How many?" he asked softly. "Can we build?" "As many as we need," the shipyard commander said without hesitation. "The entire human race is behind this. We'll build as many as it takes." 10 years into the project, 1,000 of these cutting-edge warships were hidden in the dark. By year 20, that number had jumped to 5,000. The goal had been 10,000 ships in 30 years, but production was moving so fast, they were going to blow past that target with years to spare. The Concord's intelligence agencies would occasionally spot weird things, spikes in industrial materials, odd energy signatures, but their reports always concluded the same thing. The poor humans were just rebuilding their economy after the trauma of New Cascadia. They were no threat. They were just a young, fragile, and insignificant species. It wasn't a stupid conclusion. It was a fatally arrogant one. Their analysts were comparing human activity to what they thought humans were capable of, completely blind to the fact that our capabilities had undergone a seismic shift. They were seeing the shadow of a monster and dismissing it as a trick of the light. The Vethkai grew even cockier. A decade after New Cascadia, they hit another human colony, a small outpost called Far Haven. It was a smaller raid, only 200,000 people taken, but just as savage. And humanity did nothing. The ambassador from Earth simply expressed profound concern. Human freighters kept flying their routes. Human colonies stayed quiet. It was like it never happened. To the Vethkai, it was hilarious. They'd been worried humanity might do something reckless, but now it was clear they were too broken to even try. They were the perfect prey. 20 years after New Cascadia, the Vethkai hit again, raiding a colony named Prosperity. and taking 500,000 more people. And again, nothing. Not a single ship moved. It seemed humanity had finally accepted its place. "They are utterly broken," the Vethkai commander boasted to the conquered. "We have taught them their place. They will never fight back." That's what the galaxy thought. But behind that wall of silence, a firestorm was gathering. Every new attack, every recording of a family being torn apart was broadcast across all 17 human worlds. Every tragedy was just more fuel for the cold, patient rage building in every human soul. After the Prosperity raid, Admiral Chen stood before his top officers, his face carved from stone. "How much longer?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. His chief of staff looked at the data. 10 more years for 100% readiness, sir. But we could go now. We have 7,000 ships ready. Every last one of them is itching for a fight." "Not one ship moves," Chen said, his voice as hard and cold as deep space. "We wait. We become so strong that when we finally make our move, there won't be any question about who wins. Our children have waited 20 years for justice. They can wait another 10. Because when we go, we are only going one time. We will hit them with everything we have, and we will make sure that this can never, ever happen again." He looked out a viewport at the star-dusted blackness. Out there, millions of humans were suffering in Vethkai labor camps. Out there, the old, arrogant races were probably still laughing about how pathetic humanity had become. The galaxy thought it had humanity all figured out. They were about to learn how terribly wrong they were as the 30th anniversary of the New Cascadia massacre approached. Humanity had transformed so completely it was almost unrecognizable. The peaceful, naive species that was so easily blindsided was gone forever, replaced by something new, something patient, and something unbelievably dangerous. Every child could name the fallen. Every soldier dedicated their life to training for the war they all knew was coming. Every scientist worked day and night on weapons that would shatter the galactic balance of power. And every single human, from the oldest great-grandmother to the youngest child, carried a flame inside them. They called it the remembrance, but it was so much more than a memory. It was their identity now. It was the one sacred thing that bound 20 billion humans across 17 worlds together. They weren't just a species anymore. They were a reckoning. And somewhere out there, a woman named Maria Santos was still alive. Imagine being forced to watch uncut footage from a nightmare. That's the first thing Admiral Chen did when the diplomats came aboard his flagship, hoping to talk peace. He didn't offer threats, he offered them comfortable chairs and refreshments, and then made them witness raw, unfiltered horror from the slave camps. The envoys squirmed in a sickened, cold silence. A few looked like they were about to throw up. The others just went pale. When the screen finally went black, Admiral Chen's voice was barely a whisper, but it filled the room. 30 years ago, he said, we begged the Concord for help. You told us the internal affairs of member states weren't your problem. You said the Vithkai had a right to manage their labor force. He leaned in, his eyes hard as stone. You called our stolen children a labor force. You offered us money for our dead. You laughed in our faces when we begged for justice. One of the envoys finally managed to speak, his voice trembling. The Concord acknowledges that certain errors were made. Errors? Chen's voice was still quiet, but it sliced through the silence like a blade. 18 million dead, 4 million taken, 30 years of torment. You call that an error? He stood up and gazed out the main viewport at the endless sea of stars. Your offer to step in comes 30 years too late, he said, his back to them. We gave you a chance to do the right thing, and you chose to look away. I suggest you do it again. You made it perfectly clear this was never your fight. Another envoy tried a different approach. Admiral, he said carefully, you must understand the Concorde has a considerable military. Push this any further, and we will be forced to intervene. Chen turned around, a chillingly calm look on his face. Then intervene, he said without a trace of emotion. We planned on it. We spent 30 years planning for everything, and I give you my word, if the Conquered chooses to side with slavers and murderers, you will learn the exact same lesson the Vithkai are learning as we speak. He pointed to the viewport, where the burning wreckage of the Vithkai fleet drifted like dying stars. And the lesson is simple, he added. Humanity pays its debts, humanity finishes what it starts, and humanity never, ever forgets. The diplomats left with empty hands and a report for the Concorde that said, in short, humanity isn't listening anymore. They were going to get their justice, one way or another. The conquered leaders screamed at each other for days. Some demanded an immediate attack on the human fleets. Others pleaded for caution. In the end, paralyzed by indecision, they did nothing, just hoping humanity would eventually run out of steam. They hoped wrong. The Vithkai Empire continued like clockwork. Human fleets jumped from one star system to the next, shattering any resistance, liberating every last slave, and dragging every war criminal they could find out of their homes. This wasn't a war of annihilation. Humanity didn't want to wipe them out. They were simply erasing an empire built on suffering from every map in the galaxy. Every politician who got rich off slavery was put in chains. Every soldier who participated in the raids was taken into custody. Every single record detailing human pain was copied, archived, and prepared for the trials that were coming. And across 1,000 different planets, the survivors of the camps were finally going home. They were given the best doctors, the best counselors, and all the time in the universe to heal. The scars would remain, but their chains were gone. Maria Santos was one of them. She made it back to Earth and found cousins she never knew she had. But the moment they asked about her daughter Sophia, she just shattered. She died in the camps, Maria cried. She was only 12. They worked her until her little body just gave out. And then She couldn't say the rest. But later that night, she stood at her window, staring up at the blanket of stars. Somewhere up there, human ships were still fighting for her, for Sophia, for all of them. "We did it, my love," Maria whispered to the empty room. "We didn't forget you. We never, ever forgot." And deep in the silence of space, the great payback continued. The Galactic Concord was frozen by a kind of fear they'd never experienced. For 10,000 years, the ancient elder races had run the galaxy. They'd fought wars, sure, but those wars had rules. They had boundaries. So what happens when you corner a species and leave it with nothing to lose? The Vuthkai Empire, The galaxy's biggest and meanest bully was finding out. They had crossed a line, and now the bill had come due. Just 3 months after their homeworld fell, humanity's fleet had already seized 2/3 of their territory. Entire planets were surrendering without a single shot fired. Entire fleets were being turned into cosmic dust. The most feared military in the galaxy was being dismantled piece by piece, while the all-powerful elder races could only watch in stunned horror. Before the Galactic Council, the last high-ranking Vethkai official, not in a human prison cell, made his plea.
"You have to stop them," he begged. "We are invoking our mutual defense pact. You have to help us."
The Primarch, a being who had led the Conquered for a millennium, sat in thoughtful silence. The treaty was ironclad. An unprovoked attack on one meant war with all. But then the crystalline ambassador spoke up, his voice sounding like wind chimes. "The treaty specifies an unprovoked attack," he noted. "Need I remind you the Vethkai attacked human worlds first? They killed millions and enslaved millions more. You could say humanity is just defending itself."
"Defending itself?" the Vethkai ambassador shrieked. "They're taking our planets. They're broadcasting the trials of our leaders across the entire galactic network. They are tearing down everything we built."
"An empire built on a foundation of human bones," the Zethi ambassador rumbled back, his voice cold and final. "Maybe you should have thought of that before you decided an entire species was nothing more than livestock." For weeks, the debate raged. Some of the older races, the ones with deep ties to the Vethkai slave economy, wanted to intervene. But it wasn't about money, not really. It was about fear. If a young species like humanity could do this to the Vethkai, the supposed apex predators of the galaxy, then who was safe?
"Today, it's them," the Krell ambassador roared. "If we let this stand, tomorrow it could be us. We have to put these upstarts down now."
But a lot of others weren't so sure. The leaked videos from the slave camps had gone viral, and the public was starting to see things differently. Suddenly, the Vethkai didn't look like victims anymore. They looked like monsters getting exactly what they had coming to them. In the end, only 3 races voted for war: the Krell Empire, the Vorik Hegemony, and the Cath Confederation. They assembled a massive fleet of 12,000 warships, the largest military force seen in 1,000 years. "This will be more than enough to crush the human problem," the Krell commander bragged. "The Vethkai just got fat and lazy. We won't make that mistake." The Allied fleet tore a hole in space-time and jumped right into human-controlled space, expecting the fight of their lives. What they found was a slaughter. Admiral Chen hadn't just been waiting for them. He had been counting on them. Those 30 long years of human suffering weren't just spent planning revenge on the Vethkai. Humanity's best minds had studied every major power in the galaxy. They knew Krell battle strategy better than the Krell themselves. They knew the weakness in every Vorak ship. They had the blueprints for every piece of Cath technology and had designed a specific weapon to counter every single one. The Battle of the Red Nebula was over in 6 hours. When the dust settled, 8,000 of the 12,000 Concord ships were silent, floating coffins. The survivors were running for their lives. Human ships had materialized out of thin air, using the dense red gas of the nebula as a perfect cloak. They jammed all communications, broke the massive fleet into small, terrified groups, and then picked them off one by one.
They used weapons the conquered had never even dreamed of, and in the process, they lost fewer than 300 of their own ships. "How?" the Krell commander screamed as his own bridge was being ripped apart around him. "How is this possible? You were just primitives, a backwater species. How did you become this?" Admiral Chen's voice cut through the chaos, broadcast on all open channels for everyone to hear. "You gave us 30 years, he said, his voice cold and steady. 30 years of pain to fuel our rage, 30 years of being looked down upon to sharpen our minds. You gave us 30 years to do nothing but plan for this day, and you ask how we became this?" He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "You made us this. Now you get to live with it." A second later, a single missile slipped past the Krell commander's defenses, and his flagship disappeared in a silent, brilliant flash of light. Word of the massacre at the Red Nebula tore through the galaxy like a thunderclap. The ancient elder races, who'd always seen themselves as the galaxy's shepherds, were hit with a terrifying new reality. They weren't at the top of the food chain anymore. Some scrambled to make new alliances, desperate to put a stop to the humans, but their old arrogance was gone. No one wanted to be the next one to stare down that human fleet. No one was eager to find out what humanity's brand of justice looked like up close. Others tried a different approach, sending diplomats scrambling to Admiral Cheney with offers of peace, tempting trade deals, anything to get on humanity's good side. Cheney met with every single one, listened to what they had to say, and then calmly rejected them all. "We are not at war with the conquered," he told them. "Our fight is with the Vathkai. Stay out of it, and you have nothing to fear from us. Let us finish what we started, and we will have no quarrel with any of you. But if you step up to protect slavers, if you shield the monsters who butchered our children for a quick profit, you will make yourselves our enemy, and we will treat you accordingly." The Concord heard the message loud and clear. They released a few weak statements condemning humanity's unprovoked aggression. But their fleet stayed safely parked in their home systems. From a comfortable distance, they watched as humanity systematically dismantled the entire Vathkai Empire. It took 2 years. In that time, humanity freed every last slave camp, put thousands of war criminals in chains, and took over every planet the Vathkai had ever claimed as their own. It was the most decisive military victory the galaxy had ever witnessed. But then, to everyone's astonishment, humanity didn't wipe them out. The human forces moved with the skill of surgeons. They annihilated military bases. They took over government buildings. They confiscated every single weapon they could find. But they left the civilian population almost completely unharmed. "We are not butchers," Admiral Cheney stated at a press conference. "We don't punish children for the sins of their fathers. The Vathkai people will continue to exist, but the Vathkai Empire is finished forever." The trials began on the first anniversary of the liberation. Commander Vithrak and more than 3,000 of his officials were brought before a human court to face judgment for their crimes. The entire trial was broadcast across the galaxy.
Every species watched as the sickening truth was revealed. Combat logs from the initial unprovoked attack, heartbreaking testimony from the survivors, official Vithkai records outlining their plans for slave raids, and medical reports that described the hellish conditions inside the labor camps. Commander Thrak could only sit there, forced to watch his own cruel legacy laid bare for the universe to see. He tried to defend his actions, claiming it was just the way of his people. Slavery is the natural order, he argued with chilling arrogance. The strong have a right to command the weak. It has always been this way. The chief prosecutor, a human woman named Dr. Sarah Kim, replied with a voice as cold as the void between stars. The defendant claims he was simply honoring his tradition, she said to the court.
So let's take a moment to remind everyone what that Vathkai tradition truly is. A massive hologram materialized in the courtroom, displaying images from the camps. Workers so starved they were little more than skeletons, mass graves overflowing with the dead, and photos of children born into slavery who were worked to death before they ever had a chance to truly live. "This is your tradition," she declared, her voice slicing through the horrified silence. "And this is the inevitable fate of any civilization that builds its greatness on the suffering of others." The trials lasted for months. In the end, Commander Thrak and 2,000 other high-ranking officials were found guilty of crimes against all sentient life. The punishments varied. Some received long prison sentences, others were exiled to forgotten worlds. But Thrak himself was given the most fitting sentence of all. He wasn't granted the mercy of a quick death. Humanity was beyond that now. Instead, he was sentenced to spend the rest of his very long life inside a special containment cell. Every single day, from the moment he woke up until the moment he slept, he would be forced to listen to the recorded testimonies of the millions of people whose lives he had shattered. "You wanted humans to cater to your every whim," Dr. Kim told him as the final sentence was delivered. "Now, you will spend the rest of your days serving their memory. And maybe, just maybe, by the time your life is over, you will finally grasp a fraction of the agony you caused." Vathrak was dragged away, screaming that it was all a fabrication, that humanity had no right, that the galaxy wouldn't stand for it. But no one came to his rescue. The galaxy had seen the evidence. The galaxy had heard the testimonies, and the galaxy quietly agreed that the Vithkai had gotten precisely what they deserved. The rest of the Vithkai population was relocated to new reservation worlds. They were beautiful planets, rich with resources needed for a good life, but they were completely demilitarized, and all of their spacefaring technology was confiscated. The Vithkai as a species would go on, but they would never pose a threat to anyone ever again. "You are being given a second chance," Admiral Cheney informed the new Vithkai leaders. "Use it to create something worthwhile. In 5 generations, if you can prove to us that you've learned to live peacefully, we might reconsider your status. But if you ever return to your old ways, if you ever harm another living being, we will be back, and the next time, we won't be nearly so forgiving." The Vithkai leaders were in no position to argue. They could only nod their heads and accept their new reality. With the Vithkai Empire shattered and the so-called Galactic Concord utterly humiliated, Admiral Cheney stood on the bridge of his flagship to give one final address to the galaxy. It was time to establish the new rules.
His message was beamed to every corner of the spiral arm. On 1,000 different worlds, 1,000,000 different species tuned in to watch the human admiral. 31 years ago, he started, his voice steady but full of weight. The Vithkai burned our colony of New Cascadia to the ground. They slaughtered 18 million of our people and enslaved another 4 million. We came to you, the Galactic Concord, pleading for justice. And do you know what you did? You laughed. You offered us blood money for our dead children and told us to get over it. You called us weak. You called us young. You called us irrelevant. He paused, letting that harsh truth hang in a silence that stretched across thousands of light years. We proved you wrong. The Vithkai Empire is now a page in a history book. Their war machine is nothing but scrap. Their leaders have answered for their crimes. As a threat to this galaxy, they are finished. We did that. We, the people you dismissed as irrelevant. His voice turned as hard as starship armor. Let me be perfectly clear to every single being listening to me right now. We do not want war. We have no ambition to rule over anyone. But we will defend our people. We will protect our homes, and we will never, ever allow another New Cascadia to happen. Not again. He leaned into the camera, his eyes burning with intensity. To any species out there that still believes humanity is a soft target, I suggest you look at what happened to the Vithkai. They were bigger than we were. They had more ships, superior technology, and a long history of conquest. Today, they live on reservations, stripped of every ounce of their former glory. That is the cost of threatening us. And for anyone who thinks they can bully us, I want you to remember the Red Nebula. 3 of the Concord's own elder races sent 12,000 warships to teach us a lesson. 6 hours later, we had turned 8,000 of them into monuments to their own arrogance. That is what happens when you stand in our way. We are not asking to be part of your little club anymore. We don't need your approval, and we sure as hell don't need your friendship. We're simply explaining the new reality, he said, his hand rising to point directly at 1 trillion stunned viewers across the galaxy. This galaxy taught us that strength is the only language that matters. Well, message received. From this day forward, anyone who harms our people, threatens our homes, or gets in the way of our future will face the complete and total wrath of humanity. This is not a threat. It is not open for negotiation. It is a fact. He lowered his hand, a flicker of something besides cold anger in his eyes. But we are not monsters. We proved that when we didn't erase the Vithkai from existence. We proved it by giving their butchers fair trials, a courtesy they never extended to our children. We showed mercy to a people who never showed us any. Humanity desires peace. We want to create, to trade, to discover. We want to be a part of this galactic community, but we will do it as equals, never again as someone's prey. He stood up straighter, the starlight catching the silver in his hair. Remember what we did. Remember that we waited 30 years for this justice. Remember that we never faltered, never surrendered, and never forgot what was taken from us. And most of all, remember this. We will wait again if we have to. We will rebuild our strength if we must. And if anyone is ever foolish enough to test us again, we will win again. That is our promise to the galaxy. We remember, we endure, and we do not forgive those who harm our children. And with that, the broadcast ended, plunging the galaxy into a thoughtful silence. Imagine your quiet little town is suddenly covered by a shadow so big it blocks out the sun. That's what happened to us on New Cascadia. One moment, we were simple farmers worried about the harvest. The next, an alien empire called the Lumen filled our sky, and their message was terrifyingly simple. They were here to harvest our children. They called it a great honor, a glorious ascension. We called it what it was, kidnapping. They gave us 1 hour before they'd turn our planet to dust. We were just regular people, the ultimate underdogs against an unbeatable foe. I was a first-grade teacher, clutching my son Leo's little hand as a giant countdown clock ticked away in the town square. What would you do in my shoes? Before you decide, make sure you're subscribed and listen to our story. My son Leo's favorite thing in the world was his collection of shiny rocks. He kept them in a small wooden box, each one a memory from a sunny day spent exploring. That box was his whole world, his future. And these monsters wanted to steal the boy who owned it. Our first surprise came when our planetary defense cannons, our pride and joy, fired on their ships. The energy beams just splashed harmlessly against their shields like rain on a window. They were so advanced, they didn't even bother to shoot back. In a panic, I remembered an old piece of junk in my school's basement, a long-range communicator from the first settlers. I fired it up, not expecting anything, and screamed for help into the silent void. And to my absolute astonishment, someone answered. But it wasn't an army. It was a single, gruff old junk hauler named Jax, piloting a ship that looked like it was held together with hope and rust. He told us right away that he couldn't fight them. But then he gave us another surprise. The Lumen's real weapon wasn't their giant ships. It was fear. Their main vessel was broadcasting a psychic signal across our world, designed to make us all feel hopeless and just give up. And that's when he dropped the soul-crushing truth bomb, the big reveal that changed everything. The Lumen weren't taking our children to some better place. They were psychic vampires, feeding on the pure, innocent hope of kids to stay immortal. Our children were just fuel for them. That's when the teacher in me vanished and the mom took over. What is the one thing in the universe more powerful than soul-crushing fear? I knew the answer instantly, the fierce, unyielding, terrifying love of a parent protecting their child. We had no weapons, but we had that. I used our colony's communication system to create a massive feedback loop. Every single parent on the planet focused on one thought, one feeling. You will not have my child. While Jax flew his rickety ship on a suicide mission to plant a signal booster near their mothership, we unleashed our weapon. It wasn't a scream from our mouths, it was a roar from our hearts. That wave of pure, concentrated protective rage slammed into their fleet. For creatures that fed on gentle hope, this raw emotion was pure poison. It shattered their collective consciousness. One by one, their ships went dark, silent, and dead in our sky. We had won. When they tested us, they found something stronger than anything in their arsenal. And now the galaxy knows that as long as that protective fire burns inside us, our children are off limits. In our town square, a monument now reaches for the sky. It's the stone figure of a mother, her gaze locked on the stars, a silent promise of what we endured, and a warning to any who would threaten us. At her feet, an inscription glows through the night. We protect the future. Never again. And across the galaxy, wherever families live and dream, those words have become their sacred vow. Never again, never again, never again.